From Unreliable Memoirs by Clive James, The Kid from Kogarah. I was born in 1939. The other big event of that year was the outbreak of the Second World War, but for the moment that did not affect me. Sydney in those days had all of its present attractions and few of the drawbacks. You can see it glittering in the background of the few photographs in which my father and I are together. Stocky was the word for me. Handsome was the word for him. Without firing a shot, the Japanese succeeded in extricating him from my clutches. Although a man of humble birth and restricted education, he was smart enough to see that there would be war in the Pacific. Believing that Australia should be ready, he joined up. So my mother let our little house in Kogarah, and we went to stay with my Aunt Dot in Janali, another half hour down the Illawarra line. This move was made on the advice of my father, who assumed that the centre of Sydney would be flattened by Japanese bombs about 2 hours after the whistle blew. The assumption proved to be ill-founded, but the side effects were beneficial, since Janali was a perfect spot to grow up in. There were only a dozen or so streets in the whole area. Only one of them was paved. The railway line ran through a cutting somewhere in the middle. Everything else was bush. The houses were made of either weatherboard or fibro. Ours was weatherboard. Like all the others, it was surrounded by an area of land which could be distinguished from the bush only because of its even more lavish concentrations of colour. Nasturtiums and honeysuckle proliferated, their strident perfumes locked in perpetual contention. Hydrangeas grew in reefs, like coral in a sea of warm air. At the bottom of the backyard lay an air-raid trench full of rainwater. I fell into it within minutes of arriving. Hearing a distant splash, Aunt Dot, who was no sylph, came through the back door like a train out of a tunnel and hit the lawn running. The door, a fly screen frame with a return spring, made exactly the same sound as one of those punching bags you try your strength on. Aunt Dot was attired in a pink corset, but it didn't slow her down. She covered the ground like Marjorie Jackson, the girl who later became famous as the Lithgow Flash. The earth shook. I was going down for the third time, but I can distinctly remember the moment she launched herself into the air, describing a parabolic trajectory which involved at one point a total eclipse of the sun. She landed in the trench beside me. Suddenly, we were sitting together in the mud. All of the water was outside on the lawn. Usually, my mother was first to the rescue. This time she was second. She had to resuscitate both of us. She must have been in the front of the house looking after my grandfather. He needed a lot of looking after. Later on, my mother told me that he had always been a selfish man. She and Aunt Dot had given a good part of their lives to waiting on him. Mentally, he had never left England. I remember him as a tall, barely articulate source of smells. The principal smells were of mouldy cloth, mothballs, seaweed, powerful tobacco, and the tars that collect in the stem of a very old pipe. When he was smoking, he was invisible. When he wasn't smoking, he was merely hard to pick out in the gloom. You could track him down by listening for his constant low-pitched, incoherent mumble. From his carpet slippers to his moustache was twice as high as I could reach. The moustache was saffron with nicotine. Everywhere else he was either grey or tortoise shell mottle. His teeth were both. I remember he bared them at me one Christmas day. It was because he was choking on a coin and a mouthful of plum pudding. It was the usual Australian Christmas dinner taking place in the middle of the day. Despite the temperature being 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, there had been the full panoply of ragingly hot food, topped off with a volcanic plum pudding smothered in scalding custard. My mother had naturally spiced the pudding with sixpences and threepenny bits, called zacks and trays, respectively. Grandpa had collected one of these in his esophagus. He gave a protracted, strangled gurgle, which for a long time we all took to be the beginning of some anecdote. Then Aunt Dot bounded out of her chair and hit him in the back. By some miracle, she did not snap his calcified spine. Coated with black crumbs and custard, the zack streaked out of his mouth like a dum-dum and ricocheted off a tureen. Grandpa used to take me on his knee and read me stories, of which I could understand scarcely a word. Not because the stories were over my head, but because his speech by that time consisted entirely of impediments. Once upon a moose, he would intone, there was none going bluff. My mother got angry with me if I was not suitably grateful to Grandpa for telling me stories. I was supposed to dance up and down at the very prospect. To dodge this obligation, I would build cubby holes, collecting chairs, cushions, breadboards and blankets from all over the house. I would assemble them into a pillbox and crawl in, plugging the hole behind me. Safe inside, I could fart discreetly while staring through various eye slits to keep track of what was going on. From the outside, I was just the pair of marsupial eyeballs in a heap of household junk, topped off with a rising pall of sulphuretted hydrogen. It was widely conjectured that I was hiding from ghosts. I was too, but not as hard as I was hiding from Grandpa. When he shuffled off to bed, I would unplug my igloo and emerge. Since my own bedtime was not long after dark, I suppose he must have been going to bed in the late afternoon. Finally, he went to bed altogether. With Grandpa laid up, I was the man of the house. My mother was the only pillar of strength available. One parent is enough to spoil you, but discipline takes two. I got too much of what I wanted and not enough of what I needed. I was a child who was picked up. The effects have stayed with me to this day, although in the last few years I have gradually learnt to blame myself instead of circumstances. My mother had a strong will, but she would have had to be Fabius Concator to cope with my tantrums when I didn't feel like going to school. Every second day I played sick and stayed home. Her only alternative was to see how far she could drag me. She would have had a better chance dragging a dead horse through soft sand. The school was a single-room wooden hut with 12 desks. Painted cream, it sat in half an acre of dirt playground about a mile from our house. Bushfires burned it down every couple of years, but unfortunately it was easy to replace. The first year of school wasn't so bad. I liked Miss Dear. Usually, I got more questions right than anybody else and was awarded first choice of blocks. I chose the set with the arches and the columns. I would go off on my own into a corner of the playground and build structures akin to the Alhambra or the Escorial, throwing a fit if any other child tried to interfere. Even the best set of school blocks weren't as good as the set I had at home. Passed on to me by Grandpa, they were satin-smooth Victorian creations of inch-by-inch oak, every length from 1 to 12 inches plus arches, Doric columns, metopes, triglyphs and sundry other bits and pieces. With them, I could build a tower much taller than myself. The usual site was the middle of the lounge room. A length of cotton could be tied to one of the lower columns so that I could retire into hiding and collapse the tower by remote control at the precise moment when Aunt Dot lumbered into range. It made a noise like Valhalla falling. She would have had one of her turns. These needed plenty of space and demand that I be sent to school the next day. Toys were scarce. A few crude lead soldiers were still produced so that children could go on poisoning themselves, but otherwise there was almost nothing. It was a big event when my mother bought me a little painted red cow. Presumably it was English. I took it to school and lost it. Next day she came with me to school wanting to find out what had happened to it. My carelessness with everything she bought me went on hurting her for years. She construed, accurately, as ingratitude. From the sensitivity angle, I was about as obtuse as a child can be. I was sensitive enough about myself, but that's a different thing. School, passable for the first year, became unbearable in the second, when the kind Miss Dear was supplanted by a hard case called Miss Turnbull. Dark, cold and impatient, Miss Turnbull might have been the firm hand I needed, but already I was unable to cope with authority. I still can't today, tending to oscillate between nervous flippancy and overly solicitous respect. In those days, when I was about a third of my present height and a quarter of the weight, there was nothing to do except duck. I did everything to get out of facing up to Miss Turnbull. I had Mondayitis every day of the week. As my mother dragged me down the front path, I would clutch my stomach, cross my eyes, stick out my tongue, cough, choke, scream, and vomit simultaneously. But there were still some occasions when I ended up at school, no matter what I did. It was then revealed that I had dropped behind the class. Words I could not recognise would come up on the spelling wheel. The spelling wheel was a thick card with a window in it and a cardboard disc behind. As you turned the disc, the words appeared one at a time in the window. I remember not being able to pronounce the word the. I pronounced it thur. The class had collective hysterics. They were rolling around on the floor with their knees up. I suppose one of the reasons why I grew up feeling the need to cause laughter was perpetual fear of being its unwitting object. From the start of Miss Turnbull's reign until the day we left Janali, every morning I would shout the house down. For my mother, the path leading from the front porch to the front gate became a via dolorosa. My act reached ever new heights of extravagance. Either it worked or it didn't. If it didn't, I would sit in school praying for the bushfires to come early and incinerate the place. If it did, I would either hang around the house or go and play with Ron, a truant of my own age who lived next to Hallie the butcher down near the station. Ron was a grub. I was always being warned off him because he was so filthy. He and I used to have peeing competitions behind his house. Ron's wreck of a mother used to give us buttered bread with hundreds and thousands on it. It was like being handed a slice of powdered rainbow. They must have been a poor family, but I remember my visits to them as luxuries. As well as the Technicolor bread and butter, there were vivid, viscid green drinks made from some kind of cordial. Ron's place would have been Beulah land, except for one drawback. They had a cattle dog named Bluey. A known psychopath, Bluey would attack himself if nothing else was available. He used to chase himself in circles, trying to bite his own testicles off. To avert instant death, I was supposed to call out from the front gate when I arrived and not open it until I was told that Bluey had been chained up. One day I opened it too early and Bluey met me in the front path. I don't know where he had come from, probably around the side of the house, but it was as if he had just come up out of the ground on a lift. He was nasty enough when chained up, but on the loose, he was a bad dream. Barking from the stomach, he opened a mouth like a great wet tropical flower, and when it snapped shut, my right foot was inside it. If Bluey hadn't been as old as the hills, my foot would have come right off. Luckily, his teeth were in ruins, but even so, I was only a few tendons short of becoming an amputee. Since Bluey's spittle obviously contained every bacterium known to science, my frantic mother concluded that the local doctor would not be enough. I think I went to some kind of hospital in Sutherland. Needles were stuck into me while she had yet another case of heart failure. Bluey was taken away to be destroyed. Looking back on it, I can see that this was tough on Bluey, who had grown old in the belief that biting ankles was the thing to do. At the time, I was traumatised. I loathed dogs from that day forward. They could sense my terror from miles away. Any dog could back me against a wall for hours. Eventually, I learned not to show fear. The triumph came when I managed to walk away from a dog who had me balled up against the door of a garage. Admittedly, he was only a Pekingese and about 8 inches long, but it was still a triumph. That was more than a year ago. I was 41.